Can you believe he thinks his little startup will compete with us? The words stung, but David kept his head down, ignoring the laughter that followed. He could hear the voices of his colleagues, the people he had once admired and trusted, mocking him from the other side of the room. His vision, his dream, what he had poured every ounce of his energy into, was nothing but a joke to them. Imagine being in David's shoes, the excitement of building something from nothing, the passion in your heart for an idea that could change everything, only to have it ridiculed by the very people you thought would be the ones to help you succeed. David had worked for years at one of the top tech companies in the world. He had climbed the corporate ladder slowly, carefully. He knew the ins and outs of the industry, the strategies that worked and those that failed. But what David had always known, deep down, was that he could do more. He had a vision for something bigger, something better. He dreamed of a company that didn't just follow trends, but created them. A company that embraced innovation in ways the old guard never would. So, with a mix of excitement and fear, he took the leap. He quit his job. He started his own business, pouring everything he had into it. And when the first prototype was ready, David was proud. It wasn't perfect, but it was something new, a product that could revolutionize the industry, the very industry he had spent years working in. But when he took it to his former colleagues, people he had trusted, people he thought would understand, they laughed. "You seriously think this tiny startup is going to challenge us?" Mark, the VP of marketing, had sneered. "You can't even compete with our budget, let alone our expertise." David's heart sank, but he didn't back down. Instead, he smiled politely, nodded, and walked away. It wasn't the first time someone had doubted him, but this time, it felt different. They didn't just doubt his idea, they doubted him. It was as if all the years of hard work, all the sacrifices he had made, meant nothing. They thought they were untouchable, that their company was a fortress no one could break through. As David walked out of the meeting room, the weight of their laughter settled on him. But instead of feeling defeated, something inside him shifted. He wasn't going to let them laugh at him anymore. If they didn't see the potential in his idea, then he would prove it to them. He didn't need their validation. He needed the world to see what he was capable of. The first few months of his startup were brutal. David faced rejection after rejection, sleepless nights filled with anxiety, and moments of doubt that nearly broke him. But with every failure, he learned. And with every small success, he grew stronger. His team, which started with just a handful of people, began to believe in the mission as much as he did. They were driven, passionate, and ready to prove everyone wrong. David knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but there was one thing he was certain of. He wasn't going to let the giants of the industry, those who laughed at his dream, keep him from achieving it. His idea was different. His vision was clear. And now, he just needed to find the right opportunity to make everyone see what they had overlooked. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Slowly, his startup began to gain traction. Investors started to take notice, not just of the product, but of the passion behind it. David wasn't just another entrepreneur trying to make a quick buck. He was someone with a genuine desire to change the way the industry worked, and that passion became infectious. Still, despite the small victories, doubt lingered. Every success felt like a small step forward, but there were always moments of hesitation, moments where David thought back to the people who had mocked him. The company that had once been his home, his family, was now his biggest competitor. He had no choice but to keep pushing forward, even when it felt like he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. But then, one day, something changed. It wasn't a massive breakthrough, nor was it a grand gesture. It was a single email, an invitation to meet with a potential investor who had already seen the rise of David's startup and was impressed. This wasn't just any investor. This was someone with deep pockets and the power to make his company a real contender in the industry. David could feel the shift. He wasn't just another entrepreneur trying to make it anymore. He was someone who was about to get the chance he'd been fighting for. This meeting could change everything. It could take him from the underdog to a real player in the industry. And as he sat in his office, reading the email, David knew this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. This was his moment. And it was only a matter of time before everyone who had laughed at his startup would be forced to see what he had built. David sat across from the investor, trying to hide the anxiety in his chest. He'd been in boardrooms before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just another meeting to pitch an idea. It was the turning point. The investor, a well-known figure in the industry, had already shown interest in his company. But interest wasn't enough. David needed this deal to push his startup from a fledgling dream into a serious contender. The conversation began casually, as most business meetings did. The investor asked David about his background, his vision for the future, and what had driven him to take the leap and start his company. David spoke confidently, sharing his passion for the project, but his mind kept racing. He knew he had to sell more than just a product. He needed to sell the idea that this was a company that could challenge the titans of the industry. Then came the question that changed everything. David, I've seen a lot of startups, a lot of passionate founders. But what sets you apart? Why should I put my money into your company? David leaned forward, his voice steady, but the weight of the moment pressed on him. Because I know the industry better than anyone else. I've worked in it, studied it, and most importantly, I've seen what it's lacking. My company is built on something different: innovation, efficiency, and the ability to adapt. I'm not just trying to sell a product. I'm building a solution that solves the problems the big guys haven't even acknowledged yet. For a moment, the room was silent. The investor was staring at him, his fingers steepled, deep in thought. David didn't flinch. He had said everything he needed to say. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the vision. And for the first time in a long while, David believed in that vision more than ever. I like what I hear, the investor said, finally breaking the silence. Let's take this to the next level. David couldn't believe it. The deal wasn't just about funding. It was a partnership that would elevate his company to a level where it could no longer be ignored. The investor had the connections, the influence, and the resources to help David take his company to new heights. This was the kind of opportunity that could make or break everything. From that moment, things moved fast. The new capital flooded in, and David was able to expand his team, refine his product, and scale operations. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking over. He focused on strengthening the core of the company, making sure that every member of his team was aligned with the vision. They weren't just employees. They were partners in the mission to change the industry. As the months passed, the company began to shake the industry. Sales numbers soared, partnerships with key players in the market were secured, and the media started to take notice. David's name began to appear in headlines alongside the industry's biggest players. His competitors, especially the ones who had once laughed at him, couldn't ignore the rise of his company. But even as David's success grew, he knew that the real challenge was still ahead. He had always dreamed of competing with the giants, but now that he was on their radar, he had to prove that he wasn't just another flash-in-the-pan startup. This was a war of attrition, a battle for dominance in an industry that was ruthless. And then, the moment came. The company that had once been David's biggest competitor, the one that had laughed at his ideas and dismissed him as a nobody, reached out. They wanted to talk. David couldn't believe it. After everything, after years of mockery and dismissiveness, they were finally acknowledging him. It was clear now that they had seen the writing on the wall. David wasn't just a small startup anymore. He was a force to be reckoned with, and they knew it. The meeting was set up quickly, and David walked into the conference room with a mix of anticipation and caution. He had no idea what their intentions were, but he knew one thing for sure. This was his opportunity to make them understand that he wasn't just a competitor. He was the future of the industry. The CEO of the competing company, Richard, who had once scoffed at David's ideas, was sitting across from him. There was no smile, no warm handshake, just a businesslike nod as they exchanged pleasantries. David could feel the tension in the air. Richard had been a leader in the industry for years, and now here he was, sitting across from the very person he had once dismissed. "I'll get straight to the point, David," Richard said, breaking the silence. "We've seen your company's growth. We've seen what you're doing, and frankly, it's impressive. But the truth is, your rise is affecting our bottom line. We think there's room for collaboration. We think we can help each other out." David raised an eyebrow. A collaboration? This was the moment he had dreamed of. His competitor, the one who had laughed at his startup, was now asking for help. It was a power play, but David wasn't about to let Richard control the narrative. He had built something of his own, and he wasn't going to give it up just because the competition was afraid. "I'm listening," David said, keeping his tone calm and collected. "We want to merge," Richard said, leaning forward. "You bring the innovation, we bring the infrastructure. Together, we could dominate the market." David paused. The offer was tempting, but it wasn't what he had worked for. This wasn't about merging. It was about taking control, about changing the game completely. Richard's company had no vision. They were stagnant, complacent. They had no idea what it took to innovate, to push boundaries. David's company, on the other hand, was built on progress. It was built on challenging the status quo. David smiled slightly, the decision already made. "I appreciate the offer, Richard," he said, "but I'm not interested in merging. I'm here to take over. And in case you haven't noticed, we're already on our way." The shock on Richard's face was palpable. He had thought David would cave, thought he could buy him out. But David wasn't just playing for today. He was playing for the long haul. As David stood up to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about business. It was about proving everyone who had ever doubted him wrong. Richard might have had the resources, but David had the vision, the drive, and the future. And the future was his. The days that followed David's bold rejection of the merger offer were a whirlwind. His company's momentum surged even higher after that meeting. The confidence in the team was palpable. David had not just stood his ground. He had done so with such poise and authority that it energized everyone around him. They weren't just employees anymore. They were crusaders, fighting to prove that innovation could win against the entrenched, the comfortable, the old guard. David knew that the battle wasn't just about growing his company. It was about disrupting an entire industry, taking it away from the hands of the complacent giants who had held control for far too long. And now, with the rejection of the merger offer, the challenge had escalated. He had officially drawn a line in the sand. Richard and his company weren't going to just roll over and let David take over. They would fight back. But David wasn't concerned. He had already played this out in his mind. Richard's company began retaliating in small but significant ways. They started releasing products similar to David's, attempting to undercut the pricing, ramping up marketing campaigns, and creating false narratives in the media. They had their resources, their teams, and their decades of experience. But David had one thing they didn't: agility. He could move faster, adapt quicker, and pivot when necessary. Every time Richard's company launched a new initiative, David was already ahead of the curve, implementing new features or improvements that kept his company one step ahead. But it wasn't enough to simply keep ahead in product development and marketing. David knew the real battle would be fought over the future vision of the industry. He had a deeper understanding of what people wanted, what they would need in the coming years. Richard and his executives were still stuck in the mindset of traditional corporate thinking. David, on the other hand, was pushing the boundaries, thinking beyond what was available today and looking to tomorrow. David also realized that in order to truly disrupt the industry, he would need to go on the offensive. The time for playing defense was over. It was time for him to take the fight directly to Richard's company, to force them to react instead of the other way around. But how? It started with an unexpected twist. David decided to target the market in a way Richard hadn't even considered. While Richard's company had been focused on competing head-to-head with David's in the tech space, David had his sights set on a new frontier: partnerships. He reached out to key players, big names in the industry, organizations that Richard had once regarded as his allies. These partners weren't just consumers. They were influencers, people who could elevate David's brand to an entirely new level. By leveraging these partnerships, David was able to position his startup as more than just a competitor to Richard. It was now seen as a leader in innovation, a company that others wanted to associate with, a symbol of the future. Richard's old, controlling network of connections began to fracture, and with each new partnership David secured, the strength of Richard's empire began to weaken. Still, Richard didn't back down easily. He dug in his heels, launched more aggressive campaigns, and made overtures to the same partners David was targeting, offering bigger deals, more money. He was playing his last card, his power and resources. But David had already anticipated this move. Richard was throwing his weight around, but David was playing a long-term game. The flashy deals were temporary distractions. They didn't have the vision David had. And then came the public turning point, the moment David had been quietly waiting for. Richard's company, in an attempt to beat David's product to market, rushed out a new version of their flagship product. But in their haste, they missed a crucial detail. The product was flawed. It was clunky, inefficient, and full of technical problems that David's team had already solved in their earlier iterations. The media, who had been watching the rivalry closely, were quick to report on it. The headlines wrote themselves: Richard's company falls short in race against David's startup. David didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. He had been preparing for this moment, knowing that Richard's company's rush to retain market share would lead to this. The failure was inevitable. The product was too rushed, the quality wasn't there, and the company had stretched itself too thin, trying to fight on too many fronts. David's startup, meanwhile, was focused and deliberate, continually delivering what customers wanted. The public perception of David's company shifted dramatically in that moment. No longer was it the underdog, it was the new standard. People who had once been hesitant about David's startup now saw it as the future. His company's stock began to rise. New customers flooded in, eager to work with the new leader in innovation. Richard's company, on the other hand, saw its stock tumble as investors began to question its ability to compete effectively in the new landscape David had created. David didn't need to fight dirty. The market was doing it for him. Richard's company was flailing, desperately trying to recover from the public relations nightmare, while David's was quietly pushing forward, releasing product after product with the speed and precision of a company that was no longer just trying to survive. It was thriving. And then came the final blow. The board of Richard's company, after months of poor performance and internal strife, made the decision to oust him. The man who had once been at the top of the industry, who had dismissed David's startup as a joke, was now being replaced. David's path to the top was now clear. The board came to David, offering him the CEO position at their competitor. The irony was too much to ignore. David had once been the one ignored, the one laughed at. And now, he was sitting at the head of the table, ready to steer the ship toward a future that Richard and his allies had never seen coming. David had done it. Not through force, not through manipulation, but through vision, strategy, and patience. He had taken control of the industry. And in a few short years, his startup, once the joke of the industry, had become the powerhouse that everyone had underestimated. It wasn't just a win. It was a message: never underestimate the power of an idea whose time has come.